Hello, and welcome to this episode of Rule of Carnage. This is a series of conversations in video or other formats, depending on where you're consuming it. Where myself, Glenn Ford, games designer and developer, chats to my good friend Mike Hutchinson about designing better miniatures games. So, what we thought we might have a sort of speculative chat about today is, well, you might phrase it, and I might phrase it in the thumbnail to make it more clickbaity, redesigning existing games.
Let's redesign. Dot dot
Yeah.
dot.
So what we were thinking of doing here is freewheeling a little bit um, on what game we would design if given the speculative brief or the speculative idea of designing an existing game.
hmm Yeah, so we'll take some existing popular game that you might know, and then kind of work backwards to its core, like the sort of before the design pillars existed, they're just kind of like the core idea, and then we'll start again from that point, and we'll start a new evolutionary branch.
So in this one, and this might be a little series of conversations. In this video, we're going to sort of chat a bit about designing. Well, let's call it weird World War One. Let's try
hmm
and look at World War One. So that would be in the vein of something like Trench Crusade, Last War, War Transformed. That's a few of the sort of recent popular games that have um, tried to create a skirmish game set in a World War One, but dot dot dot. Um, and so we were having a little chat about this before we started recording to try and get like a ballpark idea of what we might do. And I think as we were having that conversation, one thing occurred to me is that on the one hand, there's the Last War, which is the Forbidden Psalm sort of engine
hmm
World War One based game. There's War Transformed, which is the Osprey Games game, and there's Trench Crusade. And that's not just I'm not just splitting those out because of the normative Trench Crusade, but I'm splitting them out because I feel like Last War and War Transformed had what we could condense as a brief of weird World War One, but there are monsters and blah blah blah. Trench Crusade brief wise, you can't ignore the elephant of the room. The brief for Trench Crusade was look at this bit of artwork, do game for this, please.
hmm
So while we're sort of, I think we'll talk about designing a weird World War One game. It might not be. We might talk about what would be the brief for Trench Crusade itself, but we'll probably go a bit more generally on what we would have done for those sorts of things.
Yeah, so I think that maybe gets us like a jumping off point for like right at the beginning, which I suppose like for me, this is probably the same. I think this might be slightly different for us actually, but like quite often I will get a initial impulse of an idea that's driven by like a movie that I've watched or a piece of fiction that I've read, and like I'll have a kind of excitement about a specific image or a moment or an action or something, and then I'll want to pull on that little genre thread and see what tropes fall out and what engines might emerge, as opposed to another way of starting a game, which we've both done, but I think you're more in the habit of doing, which is like turning over a design challenge and then finding an interesting solution and then going and finding a sort of theme that might best support that design thing. Um, so yeah, so like here, I guess like going right back to the beginning of like if okay, let's redesign a weird World War One game. It'd be like, what is it that we're excited about? What is it that we want to bring to life? Because that's going to be like the kernel that drives all of the other conversations and decisions about it. Which, for the purpose of this conversation, like we can just kind of center on one somewhat arbitrarily, but like I know
Well,
what I think I would be most immediately drawn to, but what's
so
kind of top of your mind?
so the two things I think that would interest me about designing a World War One game, weird or otherwise, and we'll
Yeah.
sort of talk about the weirdness of a little while. One is the sort of the at the table mechanical interest of actual trench warfare, the sort
hmm
of the very specific terrain, the sort of rotting boots and brutal desperate life or death fighting. That a lot of it was very close up. You know, people genuinely sort of thrown into what was already a horrifying situation without any sort of weird ghoulies or anything. Often barely trained, just sort of scrabbling for survival. The other thing I think that would I find very interesting is this sort of the band of brothers idea that comes up a lot of the time when you read about World War One and you see it in sort of movies and literature. Is that a lot of the time in World War One, you know, people signed up like with their neighborhood or with their business and their friends, and they arrived at World War One as, you know, groups of people who all knew each other and had a history and had a home and had a home life, and then went through this unimaginably sort of horrifying experience to be sort of changed and come out the other end of it. And like there's a few sort of like comic book references. So there's a 2000 AD comic book called Bad Company, which is about a young guy called Danny who sort of turns up in a futuristic alien battle, which is very much an analogy of World War One. And he turns up with some other sort of fresh recruits, and he goes through this incredibly horrifying experience to the point where eventually he's the veteran and he's seeing these other like new recruits come in and just be like, well, they're going to die. I'm not going to learn their names. I don't care about them. They're not human.
Wow.
And sort of going through that journey, I think, in many ways, and trying to put that onto the tabletop is the thing that would like, I think would for me be the heart of doing something like that. I'm very interested in the sort of the relationships, trying to build sort of like emotional relationships within you know, a band like that. It's obviously something that I'm personally sort of looking at with Dauntless at the moment, but I'd love to sort of consider that in the environment of the First World War, and again the extra pressures of whatever the insanity and the horror of the weird World War. So those, I think, would be the two things that would be driving my interest of designing a game with that theme. What sort of thing do you think you would like? You said you had something in mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things for me, and it connects with that first idea, like this sort of visual and the sort of emotional, or the sort of the imagined physical experience of being in these trenches. And I sort of feel like there's such a bizarrely mucky and organic thing that, like, on some level, they're almost like a dungeon
Mm.
equivalent, in that they've got all these connecting kind of pathways and stuff, except there's a way to, like, you know, in a horror movie situation, it would be like, well, I get, like, as the protagonist, I'm always moving through the tunnels, and then things arrive over the top of the trenches, and that's like a horrifying kind of, no, you're not supposed to be able to come in from that way. That's like, you know, that's where the enemy's coming from. And I guess the other thing is that, like, amping that up to, like, to almost being like the diseased arteries of an enormous, you know, dying creature or something, like that. The whole sort of enormous, sort of filthy, organic, bloody, muddy horror of the thing, turning it into some kind of, you know, almost what's the word I'm looking for? Not anthropomorphized, but like, you know, mythologized sort of a thing. So I do
Yeah,
think that, like, for me, elements of like supernatural horror often, for me, like, like, I can see how it could cheapen an otherwise serious subject, but it could also just be like something that's really kind of accessing the more kind of like amping up the sort of the horror of it. I suppose the other thing is that, like, if we were going into this game, like, would it be something that we would be chill with, kind of like making a jolly war game experience, or is it something where we would be looking to explore something darker using it?
I mean, I think this is the I've spoken on the Discord before about my feelings about grimdark, and how much of it there is around this. I think is the sort of game that would call for a grim dark experience, both
Mm.
both as, you know, grim and dark, and to a degree what we mean by the portmanteau. I think that would be something I would want it to be at points a genuinely harrowing experience. I think one of the things that's particularly interesting about World War One, actually, and I think specifically contrasting it to World War Two, is that World War One has a situation where the opposition, the combatants, are much more sort of morally grey as to who, like, you know, whether you can say there are good guys or bad. It's like World War Two. I think people go to it again and again and again because there's a very clean bad guys, you know, you can point to, and everyone, you know, the reason that, like, Dust that we were talking about, sort of, I think, pick World War Two is you can go, the Nazis are going to do horrifying things, you know, they are blah
Hmm.
blah blah. And the fact that, like, one of the stories I read about World War One was of a British, in the British side of the trenches, the Germans on the other side of their particular area were from Saxony, and those Germans held the opinion that they were Saxons and we were Saxons, and so there basically wasn't any real fighting that went on in that part of the trenches for like a year or two, because it didn't make any difference. No one was advancing anyways. They basically just both sat there and like waved occasionally. And then when the guys from Saxony got transferred, they apparently left a sign in no man's land saying, the guys who are coming in are from like Gothenburg or something. They're not proper Saxons. Watch out. And the fighting sort of reignited in that area when they got sort of transferred. Um, and so for me, I'd be interested in a strong sort of PvPvE element. You know, a situation where you are manifestly fighting the other human forces, but that the weird war element would be a thing that would at points drive you to work together to sort of
Yeah, like
survive it.
at that point, like the purpose of bringing in a werewolf or a predator alien is so that there is a clear bad guy in this otherwise really murky situation. I think it also speaks to the problem of like, well, if this particular part of the war that we end up in isn't actually really about progressing the war or moving the front in either direction, like what is this actually all about? And then introducing that third element, that sort of supernatural element that's going to provide, essentially it translates, and I think this is where I would want to go. It's like, let's take a genre story, but let's set it in the trappings and the specific constraints of the trenches, but not necessarily tell a story about World War One on a grander level. Does that feel like the direction?
I think, like, yeah, I think what I would be, like I say, interested in is a game that is about surviving through a certain experience,
Hmm.
and sort of having and funnily enough, I recently been sort of trying to put together a review of ABC Warriors that we played a little while ago. And the thing about ABC Warriors, which I'll touch on if I manage to get that video up, that we found out. So this is the Warlord Games ABC Warriors skirmish game. Is that me and Mike found very quickly that,
Your review will go up like just months after it went out of print.
well, that's
Late
why I
review.
decided it's fair game for the channel, because we try not to do things that are like
Yeah.
live, because I don't like messing with other people's stuff, and I feel it's fair game since it's no longer
Yeah,
officially
yeah. I'm gonna do a hot new review of Void from 1997.
That yeah, that's the way to go. But anyway, in ABC Warriors, Mike and I played it. We quickly discovered that it's a game about these sort of semi-indestructible war droids. So shooting each other is largely pointless. It just pings off the other guy. You end up having to win the game by monologuing, like make you doing big speeches about what you're doing. That gains you VP. And I'd be interested in it being a game where fighting was available but pointless, like against the other human combatants, and to sort of make it a game that asks something about, you know, why it is that you put a war gamer at a table and they'll just start shooting the other guy because they've got a gun, and you know, if you've got a hammer everything looks like a nail. And I'd sort of look at things like core space, I think, is a good example of a game with a sort of escalating threat level,
Mhm.
and have some level of that to be
Yeah,
like,
like an environmental threat that walks into the middle of you all.
yeah. And I think I'd be interested in looking at a game that is about, you have some sort of objective which is about, holding a point or holding a place. And it's essentially about surviving in the environment. And you can affect the other person in their attempt to achieve that objective. But what is fundamentally going to happen is that some horror is going to turn up, and it's how both of you are going to react to that horror rather than necessarily super about how you engage with the other person. Because, like, one of the things that really, I don't know about disappointed me, but one of the things about Trench Crusade that I didn't like is how clean and entrenched and sort of utterly hateful of the opposition all of the factions in that game are. That every faction in that game has a very, very clear and clean opinion about the opposition. One of the ironies I think about Trench Crusade, like, people talk about Grimdark being about morally grey situations.
Mm.
Trench Crusade is a world in which there is a proven Judeo-Christian God, and he literally actually exists. That is not a world of moral greyness. That is a world of morality is a literal fact. It is a
Mm.
literal iron fact. There can be no moral greyness in that world. It might be like, oh, you trying to bring about, the rise of hell or the fall of heaven, but it's just like, either way, there's a definite good and evil here. This is one of the cleanest, least morally ambiguous games that there is on the market. It's just sort of been framed in a certain other way. I would be much more interested in making a World War One game that's, like I say, much more morally ambiguous, much more grey in your feelings about the other person. And I think I'd be very interested in building a quite detailed campaign system to build in that feeling of growing relationships amongst your band of brothers, sort of building connections. And I'd be really curious about being able to do a system that included a regular opposition within that relationship network.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Sort of assume that it's going to be you and a friend playing on a Wednesday evening or a Sunday night or something, and kind of bake into the fact that there's going to be this sort of kind of a love-hate relationship or a sort of ambiguous relationship by the fact that you keep fighting and you keep fighting and you're going to be fighting next weekend.
yeah, absolutely, because that I think very much was the reality of World War One for a lot of soldiers, is that they
Yeah, it immediately makes me want to have some kind of exchange of something where it's like ordinarily in these skirmish games, what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours, and nothing ever really passes between us other than bullets. Um, but it might be interesting if there's something that, like, in the heat of a moment, like, I don't know, like maybe I do save you from the werewolf, or I do throw you a medical supply or something, and then that is
yeah,
going to come back round next game somehow.
absolutely. I think I'd be interested in things like there's going to be a decision point where the monster turns up and I have the opportunity to shoot the monster or to shoot you. And you know,
Right, and
I'm
I choose to shoot the monster this time, and so there's a twinkle in two models' eyes on both sides of our forces, where they're like some trust
and I'm
emerges.
I'm holding a loaded gun, and my firing it is then going to give you the opportunity to fire gun, to like
Hmm.
reload and fire your gun. And it's like, do I shoot it at you? Do I shoot at the monster? Once I have done that, what is your response? Do you now load and fire at the monster? Do you load and fire at me? If the monster is dead, do you fire at me? If the monster is dead, do you step out of the way into your trench and we just turn around and go in different directions? And
Mm.
can that relationship be entrenched into the rules to a point where if at some point you and I could kill each other and we kill a monster, next time the two of us find ourselves in that situation, do we then have an ability to coordinate better and hit the monster harder? And so we like increase the natural chances of us surviving in that situation because we chose to not not cooperate, but not be in opposition whilst a greater threat was upon us.
Yeah, and the sort of semi-co-op nature of that makes me think of two dynamics that you quite often see in board games, which is the monsters are going to get stronger each game, and so if we haven't collaborated, we're actually going to be kind of in trouble. Um, and that's a very pandemic
Hmm.
or cutthroat caverns kind of a dynamic. The other is the like I like the fact that there's going to be I'm already imagining there's going to be some orders that you've got from your guys, and so you're supposed to do this somewhat meaningless thing that you've been put in these trenches to achieve or protect or whatever. And so there's going to be some conflict between this like irritating and slightly pointless objective that you've been given and something mechanical will likely be attached to that, but it will be getting in the way of or stretching you or pulling you between 2 points where there's also a werewolf or a alien predator or something,
Well,
and
I
there's
think
you.
what would be interesting, I think, would be like if it is a sort of campaign first game, and I think I would want such a game to be like campaign driven, is if the objective that you are given by high command to fulfill each game is about whether or not your unit gets transferred out and replaced with somebody else. Um, and so it's like if you
What,
get
insofar as you want to do well and get transferred out, or
no, as in like you just get transferred to another part of the trenches. What I mean is like if you find yourself getting to a point where the two sides are in this sort of mutual relationship of becoming better and better monster hunters
mm,
in order to survive longer and longer, and the monsters are getting more and more powerful, and you're just ignoring high command, does it then come to a point where one of your sides gets transferred out and the people who get transferred in have none of the abilities about
right, you've
monster
essentially
hunting?
got a fresh team at that point, and it's like, damn, all of the stuff that I'd built up gets deleted because I wasn't paying attention to high command's orders.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and then
that's a nice dynamic. I like that.
and possibly like the people you get that get replaced are very good at like proper warfare and fighting the other human beings
Mm.
and have none of the abilities of fighting the monsters. And so then it becomes this thing of like, well, if they get transferred out, what is then the relationship between the two players going to be, where they've suddenly got somebody who is like power matched to the monsters at
It
fighting
feels in
you?
that case like I really like that, and I feel like that case like it feels like the frictions that you're trying to overcome are like can it's almost like I don't want to roll to hit. It's like I want to roll to overcome my fear of a werewolf so that I can actually focus enough to attack it. Or I want to overcome my like self-disgust at like killing another person. And that gets worse the more that I know them or that
Mm.
we've built a trust relationship. And so when you come in, like green soldiers might be like, you know, and not psychopathically so, but like reasonably well trained to be able to hit human opponents, but not yet able to really shoot alien predator opponents because like what the hell, man.
Well, certainly, if part of the way you become better at fighting the monsters is by getting to know the other human beings, and then you get transferred out and you're replaced by somebody who inherently doesn't know the other human beings, they're going to find it easier to shoot your humans
Hmm.
than the
Hmm.
guy who knows your name or has like saw the photo of your daughter in your
Right, which is ironically, or rather appropriately, like, Arnie gets to kill the predator because he gets to understand the predator. And so over several scenes, he gets information and experience and becomes familiar with them. And so, like, when it comes to a predator, that makes it easier for me to kill them. When it comes to, someone who is approaching now being like, a colleague or friend, they just happen to be on the other army, then obviously it makes it harder.
yeah. And I think that would make it an interesting sort of hopefully an interesting emergent evolution in the game where you start off with two forces that are inherently better at killing each other than they are at killing the monsters because they've been brought up on propaganda and such like about the horrible people in the other trenches.
Mm.
And then you evolve to be worse at killing the other people because you get to know them and therefore better at killing the monsters.
But
As
you got it. But you got to defend yourself against the monsters because you can't complete your mission if you're getting torn to pieces by werewolves.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
at various points, the high command mission will be about attacking the other person and how, like, the two of you like negotiate or manage that feeling and what you think about it and who dies when and how. I think that
Mm.
for yeah, those are the those are the things I would want to look at in a weird World War I sort of based game. Those sort of those stories and those relationships. Um, I think like skirmish wise, I think like trench warfare is inherently interesting, and I've seen one
Well,
game.
I tell you what is interesting about it is that you could have measureless movement in quite an intriguing way because you would just go to intersections.
Mm.
Um, I'm trying to think. There's like a specific video game that works exactly like that. But like, yeah, it's basically like measureless movement could be just like linear movement because I can just move anywhere laterally, or when I'm at a T junction, then I can move off in that direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And you could obviously have like, no man's land being covered by like off-table machine gun emplacements. You'd have like potentially creeping barrages, minefields, all those sort of faceless dangers that don't care about the agreement and relationship that the two players in your little microcosm of the trenches have built up. And it's like, if you go into no man's land there, like my machine gun emplacement will like open fire on you. He doesn't know that I kind
So
of
do we make No Man's Land lava, or do we just have it like as like turbo dangerous terrain, or
I think you'd want I think I'd want to have it sort of like, something you could go into for extreme situations.
because I feel like the problem with just navigating the trenches is number one, there's not a trench that connects the two sides of trenches, but number two, like it really restricts the board surface area that you're using and turns it much more into a dungeon um, layout. And so I think that like having having it be really perilous but somewhat essential, like many of the missions, some of the monsters, won't play ball and you have to fish them off no man's land. Like there should be frustratingly difficult reasons to go up there and survive there, and like when exactly you push out of the trenches and in what combination and what resources you've got available to you should probably matter a lot in terms of like the timing of when you do things or something. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely like there's going to be like high command missions that are going to need you to sort of push into no man's land because that's what the high command are going to want you to do. They don't want you to just sit around in
They
your own
always want you over the top.
they're always going
Bastards.
to want you to go over the top. There are points presumably going to be like control areas and spawn points for whatever the monster threat is somewhere in no man's land.
Mm.
I mean, I think like because last war certainly had like monsters that sort of turned up. It had a fog thing where sort of creatures came out of it. I don't know about War Transformed. Was that just like player versus player? And
I can't find my copy right now. I don't recall actually. I don't
certainly,
recall.
Trench Crusade is pure player versus player. I think
Mm.
that I think that's one of the things about like Trench Crusade for me is I'm not sure how it has any of the things that would excite me about a World War I based game. Do you know what I mean? It's like all the things we've been talking about here.
Yeah, I mean it's more of a tech level thing.
Yeah, and that's why I say it's like I think there's a different design. My point is that I think there's a different design brief, and that's why at the top I said, look, I think we're talking about the relationship to what would be the brief for a last War transform.
Yeah, no, like I think where we're concentrating here is a what would we do with a trench warfare game, a World War One trench warfare game, rather than like what would we do um with a sort of 1914 punk game.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there
Where,
is.
you know, like we were chatting about this just before we got started, like, okay, it's about 10 years out, but like Malifaux Weird Games is the other side, like army game. Like to a degree, that is just kind of like a 1910 punk game. And
Mm.
like it isn't a World War I weird World War I game, but it jumped off the shelf as I was thinking about this topic because it like has a lot of the same trappings and visuals, and the costuming is similar, and you know the level of weaponry is, you know, the tech level of weaponry is similar. And so I think there's definitely a, well, like when we're coming up with ideas for games, there's definitely a place where, you know, you could reach for something like Cyberpunk, and that is
Mm.
because you want some of the trappings and the gear and the tech level, rather than saying like, okay, I'm going to deal with, you know, the themes that, you know, Neuromancer and, you know, and whatchamajigdad, metaverse guy deal with.
So
You can
I think
ignore those things and just focus on like, okay, well, let's just do like a cool Cyberpunk 2020, sexy Cyberpunk.
I think I think you're 100% correct. I also think there's a really interesting difference there between, let's take as an example, steampunk and cyberpunk, right?
Mm.
Cyberpunk, I know that there's like the visuals and the trappings and the world, but there's also a sort of like, you've got to have a matrix, a web, an internet you can step into. There are certain tropes that I think you have to touch on mechanically for a cyberpunk thing. Steampunk, there's a look, there's an aesthetic. I don't know of any mechanical thing that I would feel disappointed if it weren't in a steampunk game in the same way. And I think possibly what's interesting here is if there is a World War I punk, or whatever we're going to sort of term that, is like, I think we've been talking here about that the things that would excite and drive us to design the World War I punk game are the things, the equivalent of, well, what is the matrix for that kind of punk, rather than, okay, let's treat it as the way we're
What are
treating
the
Steam.
steampunk goggles of this? Well, it's the hats, obviously.
Yes, the pointy pickle hats. Um, yeah, and so it's like, and I'm not at this moment denigrating Trench Crusade for, essentially being about the aesthetic and the tech level and the world, rather than whatever would be the matrix for World War I punk. But I think the thing that would drive me to want to design a thing in that world is questioning what the thing other than the aesthetic is that sort of
Right, and that's, I think it's why it's relevant that you brought up ABC Warriors, where it's like ABC Warriors had something aesthetically on top of it, giant robots go to war, and then underneath there was actually some more stuff about what the stories were about. And then the game that Gav and Andy ended up designing did actually engage with that second level of like not just purely the aesthetic sort of surface dressing level, but like what's underneath. What were the stories trying to get at, and therefore is there a way that the game can access that same kind of nonsense?
Yeah,
Um,
and I think like at the top you were sort of saying, it's like, okay, well, are you trying to say something about the nature of World War I, or are you trying to say something, with the aesthetics and the setting, or does it not matter if it's
Yeah,
in.
and like you know, World War I as a setting could be something that gets you access to like, well, I want to do, you know, I want to do the unmitigating horror of being trapped in a place, and I could do that in a World War II submarine, or I could do that in a World War I trench, or I could do that in like a, you know, in an ice cave, you know, in like a 1800s expedition or something. Like I've got a theme that I want to build into and build around, and then I'm going to pick an era and a set of genre trappings that are going to support that. So that you can definitely come at it from lots of ways. I think maybe that's the fun output of this particular Let's Redesign conversation, is making that realization that like when you start with this idea of a game, you can then take it in a number of different directions, whether it's I'm just purely looking because I've got this aesthetic set of trappings that I want to build around? Or is it that there's something about that setting and scenario that really speaks to me and I want to explore ludically? Or is it that like I've got something I want to say and I'm looking for the right place to put that story and this just happens to be one of several options and I'm excited about this one?
Yeah, and I think like tracking back to like a what you were saying about ABC Warriors I think the thing that's interesting about ABC Warriors is it definitely says something about what it is like to be fighting a totally pointless war,
Hmm.
which says something about what it is like to be fighting World War One,
Hmm.
whilst having none of the trappings of World War One.
Yeah, and you bringing up that 2000 AD sort of not World War One story, like that makes me excited about. Oh well, I'm going to make a weird World War One game, but it's like it's a bit more like Rick and Morty. It's like set in kind of a ludicrous Technicolor alien planet, but actually it's still talking about the same like thematic things.
And yeah, and I think for me, like if you by trying to engage with like okay, well, what do I think are the things that are interesting about the World War One setting? The relationships between soldiers on opposing sides, the nature of fighting in this particular sort of incredibly fatal and incredibly dark environment. I think emergently you then get something that says something about World War One.
Mhm.
You end up having to put your opinion about that world, that setting, because you are saying I'm going to put in this mechanic, and that's what that mechanic is going to the voice it is going to give to the game. Right. Okay. Well, that was a chat about redesigning or designing weird World War One set games. If you're watching this video and you've
Glenn
played,
doesn't want to lean purely into the clickbait of this. Let's redesign Trench Crusade.
I mean, that's totally what the title of this video
Yeah,
is
yeah,
going to
it's totally
be.
what the thumbnail's
Fully
going to
what
say.
the video is going to be. And if anyone's watched through to this point in the video, having clicked on something that says "Let's redesign Trent Crusade," and they're like, "You haven't in any way, shape, or form," yeah, sorry about that. But hopefully, interesting conversation. But look, if you've played Last War, if you've played War Transformed, if you've like tried out the early versions of Trench Crusade, I don't think the finalized version has shipped yet. You know what drew you to those properties? Did you get your sort of the itch scratched in that way? Are there
Mm.
things that you think that we've missed in our conversation about what would be our reaction to the brief of design a weird World War One game? Um, are you more excited to see us write that game than any of the other ones that you've experienced? What would you like to see in such a game? And is there a sort of a genre, a collection of games you'd like to see us have a conversation like this about to sort of approach with our viewpoint and sort of suggest the way we do it? Because hopefully there'll be a couple of at least a few conversations in this little mini series.
Yeah, it seems like a fun mini series. Also, if you have listened to this conversation, you're like, no, that's not how I would do it. Like, tell us how you would do it. What would be the thing? Because that's what's fun about designing skirmish games is that actually they don't have to all be the same, and we can all lean into different things. So tell us where you would lean. What would you focus on with your theoretical World War One game?
Yeah,
Weird
absolutely.
War One game.
Yeah, there are 1 in 20 ways of constructing tribal lays, and every single one of them is right. There's many ways that you can approach a game. This is Mike's version of this game. Please tell us yours. As you're telling us these things, hit like and subscribe. Swing over to the links section where there are links across to the Discord, where if you have started designing a game based on this conversation, you can post it in the playtesting section and have people, including us, talk to you about it. Swing through to our Patreons that are in those links and support the channel directly, or follow one or another of the links across to places where you can buy our stuff and support the channel indirectly. But for now, I think from this conversation, this rule of carnage, it's going to be a thank you and goodbye. So thank you and goodbye. Bye bye.